Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Marsh from the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today with Orr Reno. We're really excited to be picking up this series with them again. So thank you to Orr Reno for providing this great information. I just want to give some info before we start. If you have additional questions after this webinar, I would recommend that you go to the Chamber's website, which is concordnhchamber.com. From our homepage, you can click on our COVID resource page, which has tons of links and information for you to look at, including we've just added some information about the Main Street Relief Fund, which you'll want to look into if you are a business owner. There's a deadline associated with that, which is the end of May. So definitely take a look at that if you are not aware of that information yet. Also, during today's event, you can ask questions to our presenters. So to do that, you'll want to type them in through Zoom's Q&A portal. To access that, you're going to tap your screen or wiggle your mouse a little bit, and you'll see a button called Q&A. You'll just click on that and type in your question, and it will be seen by our presenters and me, the chamber host here. So without further ado, I want to introduce Stephen and Lindsay from Orr Reno, and thank you guys again for joining us today and presenting this information.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate it. And Lindsay and I are happy to be here for continuation of our series of webinars on COVID-19 pandemic issues. And this morning we're going to talk about reopening your business, which is obviously an encouraging topic to address since we've all been kind of waiting for this possibility over the last couple of months. So let's go to the first slide, Lindsay. What we're going to talk about today are several things. First, planning for and actually doing the mechanics of getting your workforce back. We'll review the basic considerations for doing this. Secondly, we'll talk about some of the key employment laws, the state and federal laws. We'll briefly overview those and how they relate to coming back to getting people back to work. Third, we will review some guidance, a lot of guidance actually, that the state of New Hampshire has issued about reopening. This guidance has been published on various websites, and we'll key you into that. Fourth, we'll address some questions, frequently asked questions that have come up in our practice, and we suspect you all have been thinking about, so we'll talk about those. And then finally, Lindsay and I will hopefully preserve about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this hour-long session and address any questions, specific questions that you might have. As Emily said, you should use the Q&A function on Zoom to type your questions in, and we'll keep track of them and try to get to all of them or as many as we can before we run out of time. Okay, next slide. Bringing back your workforce. There is definitely going to be uncertainty for all of you as you do this. I mean, there's uncertainty for us at Orr Reno as we've been planning out bringing back our workforce, either bringing people back who have not been working at all or bringing people back who have basically been working remotely. As you see, I'm working remotely here from the Bahamas. It's going to be tough to come back to Concord, New Hampshire, but I'm going to do the best I can to get back. The first thing to do, plan ahead as much as you can. Make a reopening plan. I put it in writing. It's a good discipline to do that, and it will hopefully get you thinking about all the key issues. And then as you are starting and formulating your plan, open up your dialogue with your colleagues at your workplace. By that I mean, not only you should obviously be talking with the leadership of your company, your organization, your managers, but also with all the employees, the line employees. It's going to be critical to have a good dialogue to address everybody's concern. You have to stay flexible. As I said, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. As the cliche goes, the only thing that is certain is there will be uncertainty. From the HR, the employment perspective, I think you would be well advised to look at your current employment policies, your handbooks, your personnel policies, and review them, see what you ought to update or change in light of the new work world that we're all entering into. For example, there are going to be new paid leave rights, and we're going to talk about that in a little more detail. But your policies, your handbooks ought to be updated to address those. Some employers' handbooks have sections about working remotely. You might want to look at those sections and see if they need to be updated, or if you don't have any policies about remote work and you're planning on continuing some sort of remote work as we reopen, you should have policies to talk about how that's going to happen. Look at your safety rules in your handbook and see whether your safety policies are up to date. And in all likelihood, there's going to be some safety issues. But we're going to talk about safety concerns in more detail later, but there's going to be some safety policies that probably ought to be incorporated into your handbooks that aren't in there yet. And when you do update your handbooks, as in the normal course, you put together your new policies or modified policies, you make sure to disseminate those policies to all your employees and have your employees acknowledge the receipt of those policies in writing, so you've got that in the file. And finally, one of the consistent themes of our presentation this morning is going to be the new or the changed workplace safety measures, and that is going to be critical as you reopen your business. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, communication is key, and this should be communicating among not only the leaders of your company, the leaders of your organization, but everyone in the workforce, if possible. There may be very good suggestions from your line employees about what should happen, what has to happen in order to keep your workflow moving without jeopardizing the safety of your workers. And everyone ought to understand what you as a company are doing to manage the risks. If you're quiet about it, quiet breeds worry, and worry is not good. So you want to let everybody in your organization know what you were doing, and you want to let them know what you're doing to protect people's safety as much as possible, but also for your business or your organization to succeed. It's pretty much common sense for everybody to know that your employees are going to be very concerned about their own well-being. There's going to be mental health issues. Most people will have a much higher level than usual of anxiety. So you've got to be ready to deal with that. On the physical health side, there's the obvious risk of infection. I mean, we don't know how that's going to play out, whether there's going to be resurgence of the pandemic as we go along, but focusing on your employee well-being and their physical health is obviously critical. We'll talk more about that. A lot of you may have employee assistance programs. You should use those programs. They are there to help. They have a lot of expertise, not only on the mental health side, but they have expertise on protecting, mitigating the physical health risks as well. Okay, next slide. Talked about trying to put together a reopening plan and doing it in writing. There's a lot of things to consider. We'll talk about these in more detail as we go on in this webinar, but some things to consider. Rather than just putting your plan together ad hoc, it would be smart to have one point person or a team to be responsible for putting together your plan. You want to get a cross section of your folks, management, HR, line employees, IT. Those, you want to have a lot of different perspectives as you craft how you're going to get back to work on full steam. A phased-in approach. I think what we mean by that is you probably won't be able to just go from 0 to 100 all at once. You should think about how to prioritize your work functions. What functions are most critical to get back going right away? Which ones can you wait a little bit? Can you sort of gradually ramp up your staffing? Maybe you start with a smaller group and then you gradually increase your numbers. Think about the scheduling of people and the workflows. Can you stagger your work shifts? How flexible can you be in terms of work hours and still be able to get the job done? So you've got to think through that. The safety side, what do you have? The PPE, the personal protective equipment that you need, masks, any other equipment, sanitation supplies. Have you planned out your sourcing? From what I can tell so far, just going to the grocery store, I think there's not as much a problem as far as those supplies, but maybe as businesses get ramped up, we'll start having some more shortages. So you want to try to think through your sourcing of that sort of your supplies and equipment. Sanitation procedures. Lots of businesses have cleaning companies. If you have that, you should be in shape, and those companies at this point should have a lot of expertise on ramped up sanitation procedures. If you don't have a cleaning company that is good at that, you should consider trying to connect with some sort of outside expertise to help you in terms of, okay, what do we do to make sure people are sanitized hands, or that we're wiping down surfaces? What sort of extra wiping down should we implement? So you want to get that expertise. Physical distancing. As you're getting more people back into your workplace, you have to think about, do we need to rearrange our workspace? Are people sitting, do you have an open concept office where people sit very close together? Are we going to have to change that? How about our normal kind of work flow Do we typically have a lot of meetings, face-to-face meetings? Is there a way to limit the number of face-to-face meetings? Got to think through that. Creating an employee screening policy and plan. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I think Lindsay is going to talk about the questions we can and can't ask, or maybe I will, when it comes to screening employees as they come into the workplace. And then think again about the communication angle. How are you going to communicate this plan to your employees? And I would think you want to have this in writing in a memo or a series of memos so that all your employees understand, hey, here's how we're going to handle these, the reintegration of our workforce. Here's how you can give us feedback, or we can take questions and suggestions. And then planning out what happens if we do end up with some people in the workplace who we have confirmed cases of COVID-19. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. I can't stress how useful the information is on the CDC, the OSHA, and the EEOC websites. There's really good workplace safety guidelines on their websites, and I think in some of our slides we'll show you the links, but it's very easy to find. If you just Google CDC, OSHA, or EEOC, you'll get to their websites, and there's excellent workplace safety guidelines for you to take a look at. And then, finally, think a lot really about the mechanics of actually recalling your workforce. Probably for, if not all of you, you've had your people are on, your employees are on temporary layoffs or furloughs. How are you going to communicate with them? How are you going to bring them back? You got to make sure when you recall people from furlough that you do that based upon legitimate business considerations, so you don't have a high risk of discrimination, that you're bringing back people in some sort of improper discriminatory fashion. Okay. We've sort of briefly reviewed some of the key considerations and the planning you should do. Now let's, this slide really is kind of a laundry list of the important employment laws and regs that are in the landscape that you have to be aware of as you're doing your planning. And we'll talk a little bit more some of these in detail, but on the federal side, we have the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, the FFCRA, that's the federal law that deals with paid leave. The Family Medical Leave Act is a law that is still on the books. It's the regular FMLA for those of you that have 50 or more employees. That's another law that will probably come into play a fair amount as you're reintegrating your workforce. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, we'll talk about that in a little more detail, and the implications of the ADA as you reopen. COBRA, I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with COBRA, which is the federal law that allows continuation of health coverage. I think the one thing to note with respect to COBRA is that as part of, during the pandemic, the IRS and the Federal Department of Labor relaxed some of the deadlines in the COBRA process, so that typically there are fairly strict deadlines on when an employee has to elect continuation coverage when he or she separates from employment. Those election deadlines have been relaxed. So I just want to flag that issue for you. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is the law that relates to the privacy of health-related information. Most employers are not going to be covered by HIPAA. It's really mostly health insurance type employers and health health provider type employers that have to be most concerned about HIPAA. The CDC guidance, I already put a pitch in for reviewing that, and we're going to talk more detail about CDC guidance. OSHA is critical. Probably the sort of fundamental guiding principle as you are reopening your business is to make sure that you are providing a safe workplace for yourself and your employees. Under OSHA, there is the so-called general duty clause, which is the general duty of all employers to provide a safe workplace for their employees. And that really is your guidepost. Other federal laws, I would point to specifically the wage and hour laws. There may be some tricky wage and hour questions that come up as you reopen. For example, we're going to talk about screening your employees. That takes some time. Does the time that an employer and the employee spend on going through the screening process, is that considered hours worked? I think the answer is probably yes, but those kind of questions are going to come up in the course of reopening. New Hampshire's laws are also important and somewhat analogous to the federal laws. The law against discrimination, pretty much analogous for smaller employees to the anti-discrimination laws under the federal laws. And Lindsay's going to talk a bit about the governor's orders and the guidance and industry-specific guidance for reopening. So let's go on to the next slide. Couple of sort of general points on requests on coming back to work. I think all of you should anticipate that more than the normal number of employees are going to be absent, are going to be requesting leave. And that's going to require everyone to try to balance a need really to relax to some extent your absenteeism policies and balance that against your need to get the job done, get the work done. That's not going to be easy, but it's going to be a necessary exercise for all employers to go through. And then as you are dealing with leaves, you're going to have to be aware of the the ADA requirements, new paid leave laws passed this pandemic, the FFCRA. We'll get to now. The next slide, please. Oh, FFCRA, we had another webinar kind of totally about the FFCRA, but as part of the reopening process, we thought it would be a good idea to kind of briefly review what this law is about. It covers all employers with fewer than 500 employees, and all employees are eligible. The FFCRA creates a new paid sick leave and new expanded FMLA leave. And so for employees who are unable to work for one of 6 reasons, they're going to be entitled to paid leave under the FFCRA. Basically, government shutdown orders, and these are now starting to change. And that's why we're talking about coming back to work. but there are still orders, government shutdown orders that are partially in effect, or if the employees have been advised to quarantine by their healthcare provider, symptoms of COVID-19, caring for individuals who have reasons for not being at work themselves, or caring for a child due to school closure, daycare closure. That notwithstanding that businesses are coming back to work, schools and daycare centers are still largely shut down. Next slide, please. Under the FFCRA, employees are going to be entitled to 2 weeks of paid leave. The pay rate, their regular pay, but with caps laid out in the slide. And the employer is permitted to recoup the cost of paying that paid leave through payroll tax credits. Next slide. Aside from the 2 weeks of paid sick leave, the FFCRA also created an expansion of the regular FMLA law, Family and Medical Leave Law. And under the FFCRA, any employer with fewer than 500 employees, so even a small employer, is going to be covered. And pretty much all employees who are working for that employer are going to be covered. This expansion of FMLA is for employees who can't work because their child isn't going to school or daycare on the basis of the COVID-19 emergency. And under the expanded FMLA, there's up to 12 weeks of leave. First 2 weeks are not paid. Last 10 weeks are paid. There are caps as laid out in the slide here on what the pay rate is. And your employees are required to tell you if they need this kind of leave. Next slide. As with the 2 weeks of paid sick leave under the emergency expanded FMLA leave, the cost to the employer of paying it is reimbursed to the employer through payroll tax credits. There is an exemption, a possible exemption for employers with fewer than 25 employees, but it's a pretty narrow exemption. The employer would have to show that its business would be basically put into jeopardy by having to provide that sort of paid leave. Next slide. The ADA, I mentioned it before and wanted to circle back to it. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is the basic federal law, and there is the New Hampshire state analog, the federal law that prohibits disability discrimination in the workplace. And for our purposes, in terms of people coming back to work, I think the key points are that under the ADA and the New Hampshire version 354A, employers have to provide employees with reasonable accommodations to enable them to do their jobs. I would expect that the ADA issues would come up if you have an employee who has an underlying health condition that might be considered a disability, and that employee is requesting additional leave beyond what he or she might be entitled to under the FFCRA or under the regular FMLA. An employee may ask for additional leave in order to accommodate his or her disability. So that issue, I expect, will come up as part of the reopening process in the coming months. The other important aspect of the ADA for our purposes is that it is the law that requires employers who obtain medical or health-related information about their employees, requires those employers to keep that information confidential, to segregate it, and keep it in a secure location. So let's say you do have a situation where you end up with a confirmed COVID-19 case in your workplace. Are you permitted to identify the name of that employee to other people in the workplace? Under the ADA, I think the answer is no. That doesn't mean you should still give warning to other employees in the workplace. You've got a COVID-19 case, but you shouldn't be disclosing the identity of that person. And that law really, again, comes from the ADA. So I think that's all I wanted to say. Let's turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk about some of the New Hampshire specific reopening guidelines. And as many of you have probably heard on the news, there's the Governor's Economic Reopening Task Force, which was established by the governor to really set some guiding principles for different industries as they reopen. So far there's about a dozen different guidance documents that are available online, and we have a link to the website. And it's important to note that the Reopening Task Force makes general recommendations to the governor, and then the governor asks that the Department of Public Health vet all of those recommendations. Then the governor takes all of that input, but the governor really has final say on what goes into his various executive orders that may include these guidelines. So Executive Order 40 extended and modified the general emergency order that closed non-essential businesses and was a stay-at-home order. Exhibit B to that order provides some universal business guidelines that businesses that have remained open as essential businesses, and now those businesses that are starting to reopen have to follow. And we did want to know, a lot of questions that we've been getting from employers are these guidelines mandatory? And do I have to follow them? Do I have to follow them strictly? What if I don't follow them? And I think it's, as Steve mentioned, there's an employer's general duty to provide a safe work environment. And the governor's orders clearly state that the universal guidelines are really the bare minimum that the state is expecting employers to follow. So it's best practice to follow them to the extent that you can and make all reasonable efforts to follow them in good faith. That will help alleviate, hopefully, risks of any potential exposure down the road if, in the unfortunate circumstance, if you do have an employee that ends up having COVID at work. And it also gives you something to point to as an employer to say, we took reasonable measures and we did the best that we could. So those are just some general things to keep in mind. And we do have a link to the guidelines if you'd like to read them. So what do the universal guidelines include? Employers have to comply with a lot of things under them, but here are some of the highlights. You have to require that employees who are sick stay home. You need to develop a process for screening employees before they come to work each day, and we'll talk about that more. You have to promote frequent hand hygiene, using hand sanitizers, making those available for employees and customers. And you need to implement disinfecting practices, as Steve mentioned previously. You also need to take various steps to help mitigate exposure. So that's supporting the use of a cloth face mask where social distancing is difficult, implementing social distancing measures, modifying schedules and workflows if possible, limiting the candy dishes that usually are pretty popular around my office and those sort of common areas, coffee creamers, those types of things. And then promoting etiquette for coughing, sneezing, and hand washing. And really, again, just sending home sick employees immediately and cleaning their area. And, symptoms are continually changing that are recognized as symptoms of COVID, so keeping an eye on those. They recommend that employees be allowed to work from home as much as practical. I'm at home right now, Steve's at home right now. So we'll continue to be doing that. And you need to plan for the worst, right? Plan for a potential COVID case and what would you do? You also need to ensure employee privacy, as Steve mentioned. and also abide by all paid sick leave requirements. And there are some new ones out there. And to reflect those, you need to update your employee leave policies and also think about how you're going to distribute them and post those policies so that employees know they're entitled to those leaves, as well as best practice, having the employees sign off to say, yes, we received notice of these new requirements. And again, just communicate frequently about what you're doing. It'll help employees feel better, it'll help your customers feel better, and just making sure everyone's on the same page about what's going to happen moving forward. So on employee screening, this is a topic that's come up a lot. And I think a lot of employers were surprised when the universal guidelines came out and included things like a daily screening and temperature taking of employees. So we wanted to run through that some more specifically. So what the universal guidelines require is that an employer develop a process for screening all employees reporting for work. You need to identify a location and a point person who's going to do the screening before employees enter the workplace. And that needs to be clearly communicated about logistically how it's going to work. And then the screener and the person being screened should both wear face masks. The screener has a series of questions to ask to try to see if someone has been exposed or was at risk of being exposed to COVID-19. And those questions are listed here. Additionally, the employer needs to document the temperature of all employees daily before their shift. Now, this may be a big lift for employers, and this can be done in two different ways, but it is required. Employers are encouraged to take the temperatures of their employees on site with a non-touch thermometer. However, if this isn't possible, temperatures can be taken by the employee themselves before arriving, as long as it's documented. So I think what this means is for employers, if you are not doing the actual temperature taking yourself, employees will need to keep either a log or some sort of document attesting that they took their temperature, it was under 100 degrees Fahrenheit each and every single day. And as Steve mentioned, this would qualify as protected medical information. So however you're keeping track of this information, it needs to be kept confidential and in a separate medical file for each employee, not in their general personnel file. And then if an employee does exhibit any of these symptoms, they need to leave immediately, and their workspace should be cleaned under the guidelines. So in addition to all of those universal guidelines, there's also industry-specific guidelines that continue to come out each week from the governor. And so far, we have about a dozen of those, and they're listed here, and we have a link to the industry-specific guidelines that are added under the Stay-at-Home Order 2.0, as it's being called. So we have a timeline here. A lot of things have opened. I know in our household, golf was a big issue. Restaurants is a hot topic lately. So if you are in one of those industries, keep in mind that in addition to the universal guidelines, there may also be specific industry requirements for you to follow. So Steve and I wanted to go over some of the frequently asked questions that we've seen come up with our clients who are thinking about reopening their business. So we thought we'd run through some of them. Face masks. That's a big question that keeps coming up, and whether they are required. So wearing a face mask is recommended, although not necessarily required. Again, certain industries it may be required, but generally it's just recommended. The state is providing masks for businesses free of charge. There is an online form that you can fill out through the state and then pick up your masks at a local DMV office. And just remember to always practice those social distancing protocols as well, whether you have masks or you don't have masks. Another question that seems to come up a lot is whether employers must take each employee's temperature every day. We just covered that. Under the universal guidance, there needs to be documentation of an employee's daily temperature before coming onto the premises. So that can be done either by the employer, or if that's not possible, it can be done by the employee authenticating that they've taken their temperature for that day. And again, certain industries may have to have some different requirements there, such as healthcare facilities. And I think documentation is key here. As Steve said, really having your procedures in writing and then following them and documenting how you followed them is really best practice. And again, protecting that health information in a separate medical file is key here. What should an employer do if an employee develops symptoms while at work? So again, follow your plan. You will have thought about this. You have written out a plan. Go back to the plan and follow the steps that you've already laid out. Those CDC recommendations include instructing the employee to leave the premises immediately and seek medical advice. That recommendation is also part of the universal guidelines, so you must do that. Remember to maintain the confidentiality of your employee and try to really lessen any sort of stigma around and having a COVID symptom. You want to encourage employees who are not feeling well to stay home, and if they aren't feeling well halfway through the workday, to go home so that you're ensuring a safe workplace. When it comes to disinfecting an employee's workspace, the CDC is recommending waiting 24 hours if possible, or however long as possible, if not 24 hours, before cleaning the workspace, just to minimize any potential for other employees of those respiratory droplets that can carry the virus. And then they also recommend, opening up outside doors and windows just to get that air circulating. So we do have a link to further information from the CDC, which you should find helpful as well.
Lindsay, on that issue, what are your thoughts on, well, two things. If you tell an employee that he or she has to go home, what if they don't want to? And secondly, how do you deal with the pay issue, wage and hour issue, if someone goes home, is instructed to go home?
Yeah, so those are both good questions. The employee who doesn't want to go home is a tough one, but really you have to require them to go home. You can point to the universal guidelines for businesses and the governor's executive orders that say, we are required to make you go home. So they know that it's not, some people stay, some people go. Everybody's got to go home who is not well or is exhibiting symptoms. And that's going to be hard because, I think especially in New England, we're the live free or die state. Here in New Hampshire, employees say, oh, I'll just, go into work, I'll make it through the day. But really it's better for everybody's safety right now. If you're not feeling well, stay home. And that needs to be clearly communicated as an expectation before employees return to work, that we will require you to go home, and then follow through actually requiring those employees to go home. And the pay question, if you need to refer back to your sick leave policies and the required sick leave, whether paid or unpaid, under the new federal laws and state laws. What do you think, Steve? Anything else?
No, I think that's right. For the pay, yeah, look at your policies. I mean, for someone who's salaried, you typically are gonna, you cannot dock somebody's a salaried employee's pay under those sort of circumstances, though.
So another question we've seen a lot is, what should an employer do if an employee has a confirmed case of COVID-19, right? And this is, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And so again, your plan should include the steps that you will take if this happens in your workplace. Some of those steps will include reporting it to officials if it's work-related. OSHA and the State Department of Labor do require workplace illnesses and injuries to be reported, and COVID can be one of those reportable injuries or illnesses if it's work-related. So you would need to report that.
Yeah, and actually, while we're on this topic, I got an interesting question from one of our viewers about, well, what about if you're a business with customers, obviously, what about informing your customers that you've got a confirmed case of COVID-19 from one of your employees?
That's a good question. So I think what's likely to happen in practice is that you may not know the customer's contact information to do, basically contact tracing after the fact, which the state will do. But remember, the state is doing that. So if that person has a confirmed case, it's because they went and got tested and had a positive test. And that information is sent from the healthcare provider to the state, and the state is performing contact tracing. So that's sort of, I think, the backstop is that the state is in charge of contact tracing. The business may have an interest in doing some contact tracing with its own internal employees, or if you happen to know a customer who has been in contact, prolonged contact for some reason with someone who had COVID, you may choose probably to let them know. However, again, you need to protect the identity and the confidential nature of that employee's identity when you're doing that. So I think, it would be up to the employer if they wanted to do that. But again, the state will be doing the contact tracing as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it is important. You have to protect the identity of the employee, so you couldn't disclose the identity of the employee. I think there's an interesting question if it's, let's say it's a retail business and you have people coming in, or a restaurant and you have people coming in. Do you have a legal obligation to let new people who are coming in, new customers, know that, hey, we've had a confirmed case of COVID-19 here in our premises? I don't think you've got a legal obligation to do that. I think it would be a matter of choice. And I think that's a tough question. You don't want to harm your business, but at the same time, and I think if you've taken all the correct measures to make sure that there's no continuing risk of exposure or contamination, I don't see a legal obligation for the business to inform everybody who walks in the door, oh, by the way, we've had an employee who had a confirmed case of COVID-19. What are your you have any thoughts on that, Lindsay?
I think that's right. I think, you can certainly let people know that you are following the CDC's recommendations, the state of New Hampshire's recommendations. And as long as you are following those, I think that's, sort of the standard that's expected. If you want to choose to go above and beyond that standard, that would certainly be up to you as a business or an employer. Tough question though. So when employees do return to work, can an employer require a doctor's note for certifying fitness for duty? This is something that has come up, and the EEOC latest guidance has answered the question that yes, you can require a doctor's note certifying fitness for duty when employees do come back to work. There may be some different approaches since healthcare providers may be pretty busy at certain times. So think about, do you need a formal note? Can it just be a quick email or a phone call with a doctor? But yes, you can require that before an employee returns. Another question that comes up a lot is getting employees to actually come back to work. So what if an employee refuses to return to work for fear of catching COVID? And this is a tough one, right? Because you want to make sure your employees feel comfortable at work and that they do return to work, but some, for various reasons, may still be fearful. As Steve mentioned, anxieties are high right now. So I think you really need to look at this on a case-by-case basis, and you need to run through whether there is a qualifying reason for this person to not be returning to work. Does this employee have a COVID-related qualifying reason to stay home under an executive order or the federal law? Are they self-quarantining? Were they told to quarantine by a healthcare provider? Are they required to stay home because they lack childcare because of COVID? All of those things we talked about. Run through that that list of reasons to see if any of those are in play here. Similarly, you need to look at the FMLA and the new FFCRA to see if that may be triggered. And is this protected leave for a disability under the ADA? You know, it's not automatically a disability because you may be in a high risk category. Steve and I talked about this yesterday. Just because you're over the age of 60 probably doesn't mean that you would qualify for ADA disability leave because of COVID. But is there another serious health condition here that may be in play for the ADA to be triggered? And are you participating in that back and forth with the employee to find out, is there a reasonable accommodation available that won't cause you as the employer undue hardship? And then you also need to look at your other accrued paid time off, vacation leave, sick leave that you offer in your policies, in your employee handbooks. Some other things just to think about that are good practice. Think about, okay, so if the employee is fearful of coming back yet so soon, can the employee work from home still? Can we do a flex schedule? Can they come in after hours? Is there a different workspace that they can work in? Can we give them their own office space? Can we make sure that they're working at least 6 feet apart from anyone else? Think about those things and see if there is any sort of measures that you can take to alleviate some of those concerns that an employee may have, especially if it's an employee who you'd like to retain long term. And another thing that we wanted just to note was that for PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program loan borrowers, you should really document in writing any offers for employees to come back to work to support your loan forgiveness applications. And then also, just as a best practice for all employers, you would want to document that you did offer an employee the opportunity to come back to work. What if an employee refuses to return to work because they're making more on unemployment? This has been something that's come up quite a few times. So employees who refuse to return to work just because they're making more on unemployment compensation legally are not entitled to keep receiving unemployment benefits if that's the only reason. But New Hampshire is a bit unique because an employee can receive unemployment compensation benefits and self-attest that they are self-quarantining because of COVID-19. They do not need a doctor to tell them to do so under New Hampshire's executive order. And so the Employment Security Commissioner has mentioned that until May 31st, at least, which is when the current order runs through, a person could still refuse to return to work and continue to receive unemployment compensation if they are self-attesting that they qualify under the emergency orders, which includes self-quarantining. This is a tough one. Employers are running into this. We're hearing about it. And I think we'll probably get some more clarification from the governor, the U.S. Department of Labor, and others in the coming weeks. But for the time being, this is the status, at least through May 31st, that we know of. And just remember that you can't, as an employer, make the employee come back to work. So what you can do is, again, document your offer to return to work and keep any documentation of the employee's refusal to do that. If they do return simply because they want to make more on unemployment and it's not because of any protected other reason, then you can look at terminating their employment if you need to. Again, consider risks like discrimination claims and also whether there's some other legal right to some other type of leave or paid time off that needs to be utilized before termination. Steve, did you want to add anything there?
I guess the only thing I'd add is I did pull up the New Hampshire Employment Security's website to see what they specifically said about, what the claimant, the employee, has to self-certify to in order to keep getting unemployment benefits for COVID-19 reasons, including the extra $600 a week under the federal law, which is really the law that kind of makes the big difference, because for some employees, they do end up collecting more in benefits than they perhaps were earning on the job. And it was interesting. I mean, the series of questions that are listed on the website are, I'll just quickly read through them. They're supposed to self-certify, answer these questions. Last week, Did you have COVID-19 or did you experience symptoms and seek a medical diagnosis? Did a member of your household have COVID-19? Were you caring for a family or household member that had COVID-19? Were you caring for your child or other person because of school or daycare closure? Were you unable to work because you were self-quarantined on the advice of a healthcare provider? Were you self-quarantined at the direction of your employer? And those are the sort of self-certifications that the employee is supposed to make. So it's interesting, and we'll see how that plays out. I suspect that, as you know, assuming that things go okay in terms of the reopening process in our state, that Employment Security may modify its pending executive order.
I think that's right. So we have just a few minutes, but we'd be happy to take your questions.
Yeah.
Our contact information too, and as Emily said, if you have remaining questions, you can always go on through the Chamber's website as well. So Steve, any other questions?
Yeah, there were, we already talked about the question about does a business have to disclose to customers? Question, do you have any recommendations for an app or other electronic screening methods? I know I've seen some press that there is a new free app that is done by Microsoft and United Healthcare, a free app to screen employees. I was just trying to pull it up on my computer here to see if I can get the name of it. Okay, it's a coronavirus screening app called ProtectWell, ProtectWell. I'm assuming there's others, including other health insurance companies, who are putting together these apps. I don't know, Lindsay, are you aware of any other screening apps that might be easy to use?
I think we're going to see more of those coming out as more states recommend that screening be mandatory. But I think you're right, Steve. It's a good thing. Check with your benefits manager and your health insurance company to see if they've developed one of those.
And we have a question about are there expiration dates for the newer unemployment benefits? I believe it's December 31st of this year. It's calendar year under the FFCRA.
I think that's right. I know it's being debated whether to extend it or to increase it in Congress right now. It doesn't seem like that's likely to pass in its current form. So it may change, but I think that's right, Steve.
The federal $600 too would be part of that end of the calendar year?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is true. See if there's any other ones. Okay. One other question that I didn't think came in, but seems to be coming up is what happens if we as a society are in the fortunate position that a COVID-19 vaccine is created. What happens then? Can an employer mandate that an employee take the vaccine in order to come back to work or in order to stay at work? That's sort of a tough question. The conventional legal wisdom about vaccines in general is no, an employer cannot mandate an employee take vaccine, except for certain types of workplaces, such as healthcare institutions, hospitals, and so forth. But other than that, the general answer is no. In that if an employee has an objection, maybe a religious objection, maybe a health-related, disability-related objection, the employer cannot require the employee to be vaccinated. But this is a fluid area, and especially in the pandemic context, that may change, and we may have more of a balancing test where you have to balance the burden on the employee who is objecting against the burden on the employer of having someone who's unvaccinated in their workplace. So I think the answer to that question is a little unclear right now. I think we've handled all the questions, and I think we're also coming to the end of our hour. So unless you have anything more, Lindsay, I think we can turn it back over to Emily of the Chamber.
Sounds good.
All right, well, I just want to give a couple quick announcements. First off, it's not on the slide here, but this Thursday we're hosting a webinar with Mayor Jim Boulay of the City of Concord. So if you're interested in a COVID-19 update from the city, please tune into that event. You can access that and register online on our website, which you'll see on screen here. We also have applications open for our Leadership Greater Concord program. It's a really amazing program for future leaders in our community, so you may want to look at that. Also, a great way you can support local businesses right now is to nominate them for one of our Pinnacle Awards. So we're accepting nominations for Small Business of the Year, Business of the Year, Nonprofit of the Year, and Business Leader of the Year. So you can find more information on those things on our website. Thank you, Stephen and Lindsay and Orr Reno for working with us for this event. We're planning on another webinar next week, same time, also on Zoom. So please keep your eye out for information on that. Thanks for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.